And we are finally live now. Clearly, the heat is getting to everybody, and I wasn't able to press the go live button properly. But welcome, everybody, from wherever you are in the world. I know we've probably actually all got fairly similar temperatures, actually, except for I'm just about 7 hours behind you in the UK. So, hey, there we go. But welcome, as ever, to our monthly Men as Allies conversation, and I hope everybody is surviving the heat. So last month we explored the culture we create, and this afternoon, as it is for me, we're taking that next step, because most organizations can tell you what they value: respect, trust, inclusion, belonging. But culture isn't measured by what we write. It's measured by what people experience. So, I'm going to throw it to you guys. Firstly, welcome. And, have you ever worked somewhere where the values, that poster on the wall said one thing, but didn't quite match what happened in reality? So, yeah, I guess I'm going to throw it to you guys. What creates that gap? And how does that work for?
I'm going to have to be pretty careful here. I would say yes, with respect to my esteemed former employer, that there was a little bit of a gap between the value statement and proposition around purpose and how that then aligned to the experience. As I say, being a little bit careful and diplomatic. I think there lacked a little bit of honesty in it, in that a lot of what they said was spot on.
Yeah.
But there was a big old elephant in the room about the creation of shareholder value, which didn't really exist in the statement, and yet was really quite an impactful thing in the way the whole organization lived and breathed.
No, and I appreciate that you have to, play the diplomatic card. But I think it's true of so many organizations, across the globe. It's like, there's typically values slapped on the wall. This is what we value. And then, even as guests, as even in my experience in this hotel, if you've seen my post this week about the kettle, and you'll know what I mean, was that they put guest experience at the heart of everything, and in the description told me that I was definitely going to have a kettle in the room. In fact, it was one of the reasons, believe it or not, why I upgraded to the room I did, because it was also slightly more space, was because of the kettle. And also because I knew I was going to do a live. So I needed a bit more space than, frankly, sitting on my bed, being able to touch both sides of the walls. And when I arrived, funnily enough, there was no kettle. But lo and behold, later that day, a kettle arrived. And for me, in that moment, that was the hotel actually living their values, because the way I experienced the values that they had on the wall was very real. And I think this is where, for me, it's so crucial when it comes to allyship, in terms of having people on board, is that it can't just be lip service and, a poster on the wall. I know, Mark, thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting thing. And I've worked for plenty of companies that have values on the wall, and they're lovely. They sound amazing. They sound great. They're not true. They're certainly not lived. They're an ideal. They're something that they would like to be real, but they're not lived. And I think sometimes organizations confuse their mission with their values, what they're trying to achieve with their values, and that drive becomes the pivotal thing. And I think that's the key thing in where we talk about values. Sometimes we might espouse to have certain values, but what we want in the moment becomes more important than the values that we say that we're trying to live, or we say that we represent us, or that we pretend that we are about. And there's that there's a deliberate, a willful blindness to that truth, you know, in many respects. Like how many places, how many organizations do truly live by their values? And the ones that do tend to be the ones that you have respect for, that work in environments that care for people. But not even in all of those, like, you know, you'd have, like, why does every hospital you have go into it have the Hippocratic Oath stated on the wall, you know? Because they're trying to remember and trying to be something. And I think that's dangerous. If values are ideals, that's not a good thing, because ideals are up here. They're something to live towards rather than to something to live to, you know, or to live at, or to live with, or to live as. And I think that gap is a big danger.
And I think you're right. And because in that gap that's where it can go wrong, when pressure increases and, you know, there's conflicting perspectives. And I think that's where, for me, that's where the challenge can come, when we're trying to build allyship, we're trying to work men and women together to bring greater understanding. It's in that gap that actually things can start to, I suppose, break down quite quickly. You know, I think it's because the more pressure that we apply and the lack of co-creation of those values and feeling that you are actually living them, the experience is totally different. In fact, you're not experiencing them. You know, they are just words and therefore relatively meaningless. And therefore, in the moment, they're hard to uphold.
It's really interesting. At risk of going slightly off topic here, it's something that's come through for me a fair few times of late in the world I operate in, which is obviously you can see around burnout and stuff like that. Some of the worst cultures I have seen for this actually exist within HR. HR consultancies and in-house HR teams, and this is not one I refer to my previous employer, where actually I think we were really good in that function. But the tone they set for the organization and for their clients, if it's an HR provider, and yet the values that are being lived and experienced by the people in that function run contrary to every piece of advice they then give to those clients or stakeholders. It's shocking sometimes. And so I do pick up a number of clients in this HR space, and it just then impacts, and this is where I think we can bring it back to the narrative that we're talking about, it impacts their ability to then provide and stand behind the advice they're giving, because they're not experiencing it themselves.
I think that's so true.
So yeah, no, and so I was just sort of theorizing, if we equate that to sort of the area of focus here, you know, there's a lot of positive noise about equality and allyship and all these sorts of things, but it's then the experience that women have that will shape whether they really believe it and invest in it and feel the security of it, rather than the words that come out, because if they don't feel it, nothing changes.
And that's the critical thing. If they don't feel it, then nothing changes. And I think that is the crucial piece, isn't it? It's, you know, and I guess there's probably a lot of people who don't feel it. They can't feel that there's been a change in, you know, their experience. It is just words on a page. They're apprehensive about speaking up. They don't know how the response is going to be, and so therefore, you know, that gap that you talk about, Mark, just widens.
And it's a challenge there that you know, in one way we have these values that we're supposed to live, if not even simply aspire to, but to actually live. But in another way, we have an agenda, and the agenda is different, and it can't meet values. And I'll give you two examples, right? Of what I mean there is. So Gaelic football is in Ireland is an indigenous sport, but it's in every corner of the country, right? It's everywhere. It's what people do. It's given the church kind of has collapsed in many ways, it's now the cornerstone of most communities, and it would have very strong values about inclusion and people being involved, and that would be the value that it's football for all. Like, the club is set up locally where I am at the moment, a new one, and the existing club that's been here for 60 years is really against it, but it makes sense because of population base, and they have denied players being able to transfer over to a new club, on the basis that there's football for them here, as opposed to the value of the organization being football for all. So their agenda is going against the values of the organization they're a part of. Now, if I bring it to, I had a post today and I used Conor McGregor as an example because he's a toe rag, right? But he was convicted of rape in a civil court in Ireland, and his appeal was thrown out as well. And he's fighting this weekend, and it's just the only reason it's in my head is because I saw a couple of videos on Instagram a couple of days ago, somebody doing a vox pop and people asking them, will you support Conor McGregor? And everyone who they asked who was Irish said, not a chance. And they asked an Australian guy, he said yes. They asked an American guy, he said, absolutely, I love Conor McGregor, right? But maybe we're more tuned into the story of what he is, right? But then a lot of other lads, the people who still support him in Ireland, if you go online, you see the comments on the posts, if they're not bots, are men between 15 and 30 years old, right? That's it. Who support him and claim that he was, what didn't happen, all the rest of it. Which is a perfect example of, if you ask these guys, is rape okay? That's absolutely not. No way. But if you ask them about Conor McGregor, their agenda would be, he's great, I admire him, I want to be like that. And that's that clash between an agenda that I have and the values that exist within this space and the values that I might hold. It's very hard because an agenda can be based on motivations, can be based on our desires and those kind of pieces, like, as opposed to what are our values, what are our values really mean. And it's very hard to throw something out. I'll give you one last thing of it. I remember years ago, right? There was a journalist in the Irish sports journalist. His name was Tom Humphreys, and he wrote an article on Monday morning. It was the best piece of sports writing of the week, every week. It was just random. He was an incredible writer. And then suddenly he disappeared. There was a story in the news about an famous Irish sports journalist arrested for paedophilia, for having sex with an underage girl. The girl was 13 or 14, I think. And I was like, God, it couldn't be him. Then I found out it was him. And I was devastated because I didn't want it to be true.
Yeah.
I wanted it not to be true because I loved the work that this guy was doing. Because I was like, my agenda was, no, it can't be true. This guy was amazing. This guy was great. But the reality was, no, he's not. So what's important? My values here? What do I value? Or what I want?
Yeah.
And, maybe it was an easy one to do, but just as an example, I was very conflicted for a little while. I go, no, but this guy's a hero, And I think that's where people struggle in that space too, when they look up to, like, let's say a man leading a space and he's being very misogynistic and he's calling out, he's being very derogatory to women and not making the space safe. But we look up to him because he's a hero or because he's a star or because of whatever else he is. And our agenda is we want that for us.
And that's a really good point, because it is, and whose agenda is it? Who, what is the narrative that's driving that? And, we can become, I think, quite blind to some of the things in the description that you had of this guy who you looked up to on the one hand, and then you heard this other story, and what I'm hearing is that actually in some ways you were slightly blind to what was going on, and that led to this sort of conflict for you. But I think when you get into organizations, that becomes even bigger. And I guess this is back to your point, Matt, where then HR then start becoming actually probably excessively black and white, and yet it's not really a black and white thing.
No, absolutely. And just reinforcing what Mark's just there, I think you can point to the entire culture that created everything that sort of came out around the BBC and other media figures and outlets across the 80s, 90s. He's the star, we can't sort of impact what he's doing. Yeah, we know there's some stuff going on. We're not 100% sure what it is. We're not quite comfortable with it, but we won't pull on that thread because he's a star. So can't do anything about that. And I think now the reaction, I think with the BBC particularly, the reaction that we've seen to the Scott Mills situation, where on one hand, again, I really like Scott Mills. I'm looking at it going, oh, he's been treated a bit harshly here. Like, this is something 20 years ago. The evidence isn't quite clear. There's not a lot around this. Oh, that feels really harsh. At the same time, I think it very clearly does send the message. We need to draw a line here. We need to be very clear. We do not tolerate anything here. And I'm sorry, but just cut it off. So, yeah, it's absolutely this situation where, I don't want, like, Scott Mills is a very popular person. All the people being interviewed who work alongside him are like, oh, but he's wonderful, he's lovely, like he couldn't have done anything, and da 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 da. And the two can be true at the same time. But I think the BBC have sent a very, very clear message that has drawn a line in the sand for future situations that just says, enough, this organisation doesn't accept it anymore, which I think can only be seen as a good thing, frankly, even though I enjoyed listening to Scott Mills on the radio every day.
Yeah. And do you think that, I mean, look, don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning, that sort of behaviour going on, but do you think it has to be such a hard line approach that, like, literally it's zero tolerance?
I think for an organisation that's had such problems with it before, I think yes. I think if it was a different institution that didn't have the cultural history or the difficult history that the BBC had, maybe it would have been a different situation. But I think given everything that's gone before, I think they had to be, really.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, guys. And look, the BBC means something very different to yourselves than it does to me, right? Because it is this bastion of Britishness, and we do the right thing and all the rest of it, which I can tell you it doesn't from my perspective. We already knew that, but even only this week, a clip is online. I think it's from Newsnight, where Kay Burley, the Sky News presenter, was on it, and there was a couple of ladies on it, and they were talking about, a couple of women on it, talking about abuse and abuse victims finally coming forward. They're talking about people who are victims of Henry Mountbatten. They mentioned Jeffrey Epstein. They mentioned Prince Andrew. And at the end of this conversation, Kay Burley said, "Oh, we must remember also, though, that he was a war hero. I think that's worth noting." And like, the other two women just stopped and went, like, what? What? So there's like, what is your agenda? Like, what's that establishment agenda around this whole thing that is like, this is fine? And so I'll go back to the Conor McGregor thing. So Conor McGregor is on the Jimmy Fallon Tonight Show, right? Why is he there? Because he's part of the establishment agenda, a rich elite, that he can do that's fine, that his actions don't have consequences. He's part of the entertainment space, and so we can allow him to do that, despite the fact that women aren't safe around him.
And I guess it's back to what is the story that we're then saying when we invite people like that into a conversation that has, such reach, like Jimmy Fallon. It's like you all, it's almost implicit that you're condoning that behaviour, which makes it harder then for, if you put that into an organisation, that makes it harder for people to know exactly where they stand. Because, if that's, whilst they could take a hard line approach, but actually then reinforce it by bringing together and, effectively putting people like that into the spotlight within an organisation and going, well, don't forget they're a war hero or whatever. Actually, where does that leave people feeling comfortable about what they can and can't say, and how they will and won't be treated? I mean, it's almost setting up the conditions that says, well, it depends who you are, because if you effectively rich, famous, whatever, got great history, then you'll get away with it. That's the kind of feeling I'm getting, from that example. Put it into an organisation, and that's really what they would effectively be saying. Hence, why, as you say, Matt, that the BBC had to really come down with quite a hard line. That no, zero tolerance, because they faced so much criticism on the previous situation where they'd left it a bit too long and deliberated a bit too long before taking any action whatsoever. I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts?
I mean, the Jimmy Fallon thing just really irritates me intently, because I see things which make me think, oh, we're going in the right direction. Now, I then also have some skepticism about, the source of that move in the right direction, i.e., look, I guess being a massive Manchester United fan, the big case in point in recent years for me was the case of a very talented young footballer called Mason Greenwood, product of the Manchester United Academy, made his debut for England at a very young age, seen as the future of the club. Big articles on Match of the Day talking about, how if this guy doesn't break all of Alan Shearer's Premier League goal scoring records, something will have gone wrong on the way, because he's such an amazing talent, left foot, right foot, everything, blah, blah, blah. And then there was this situation with his partner where she took photographs of the result of physical abuse he'd received from her, posted them online. She posted audio that she'd been brave enough to record of him saying, I don't care what you want, and basically forcing himself on her. And obviously Manchester United as an institution took the call of, right, we need to immediately suspend him. He cannot play for our club. Thumbs up. I'm conscious of some other figures recently where that hasn't happened, where Premier League football clubs have said, oh, well, he's innocent until proven guilty, so he can continue to play. Manchester United drew a hard line and said, no. Now, was that because they hold much better values than other Premier League clubs? No, I think it was just because evidence was more in the public domain that suggested guilt. Then what happened was the partner he was with is still his partner. They've now had a child together. And funnily enough, she no longer wanted to present the evidence in court around this case. And so the case ultimately ended up being dropped. Manchester United sent him out on loan to Getafe in Spain. Basically out of sight, out of mind, get the problem away. At Getafe, there were a fair few fans going, we're not entirely comfortable with him landing at our club, but hey-ho, it's okay because he's a world-class footballer. And then, at the end of that season, Manchester United set up on a path of trying to reintegrate him into the club. There was such uproar with that. The women's team quite rightly came out and created a massive stink. Fans of the club, both male and female, came out and said, oh, my word, no. And yet, at the same time, there was obviously other commentary saying, oh, well, he was found not guilty. It's fine. To which everyone went, have you heard the audio? Have you seen the pictures? So ultimately, they ended up selling him to Marseille. And again, I think a little bit to your example with Conor McGregor with Australians in the US, where they're not so close to the story and the realities of it. I'm not saying Marseille were happy as a club to take him. There was there was definitely pushback there as well, but it was a case of, well, we're not so close to this case. We don't know it so well. And he's a world-class footballer. Yeah, okay, we'll accept it, signing him, but there were still big problems there. So every time I think there are moves forward, like that movement of rejection by the Manchester United women's team and significant supporters to say, if this happens, we will stop supporting Man U. We are like, this is a line you cannot cross. Brilliant. For everything that there is like that, then you have other Premier League clubs continuing to employ people who have been arrested. And then you have things like Jimmy Fallon normalizing that, oh, yeah, no, this guy can remain in the public eye. That's fine, And it's intensely frustrating.
Is that just such an example, though, of you know, we like to put our faith in organizations that they might represent, because they represent us, let's say, or we allow them, particularly sporting organizations, a great example, allow them to represent us. But maybe their values aren't quite in line with what we will think. Like, there was a rugby coach being hired by Munster Rugby earlier this year, and they brought him in and all. The board brought him in. And then there was suddenly an outcry because he had been convicted or accused of rape a couple of years, a few years previous to that. Like, so there was a huge outcry amongst the fan base. And they said, no, we're going to stick with this guy. And they stayed for about a month, and they realized we can't get rid of this. The smell won't go away. Oh, we're sorry, we made a mistake here, you know? And that happened a couple of times. There was an Irish rugby player and another guy in a rape trial that it was found inconclusive in the end. The evidence isn't pretty, and then they never played in Ireland again. They played in England and in France, but were never allowed to play back in Ireland, you know, on that basis. So it's interesting though that the club wanted to keep them, but then they realized that the outcry would be too much. And it's such an example that it's not that the club responds to the club's values or the institution responds to the institution's values. The institution responds to the public outcry as to what's the right thing to do, and that becomes the thing to do. Which in a way shows us we can't be trusting and giving faith in the institution, but at least we can in people, because in general, and it goes back to, as we've discussed here many times, that idea that 4 in 5 men don't support the likes of Conor McGregor and all this kind of stuff, you know. So the voice against is very loud, and when stoked is very loud and can change an organization's attitude. To bring in even in the BBC in it, they know that they have to do the right thing because the backlash is too much. It's too loud. There's no way to deafen it. It's so loud that they have to be seen to do the right thing as quickly as possible in all these situations. But that's because our voice is loud enough.
And I guess to that point, does it, you know, and I've kind of where I've gone to in my head, you know, hearing those two, you know, several examples really, you know, does it mean that it just has to be from, you know, people shouting louder? Because, you know, for me, it just feels like, unless we do that, then nothing changes. But then I go to a place of, why should it come to that in the first place?
Well, I think it's what Mark said at the beginning, that the values are fine to a point. And the point is if it conflicts with our mission. So like Manchester United's mission is to create the most successful football team that they can, sell the most shirts, make the most money and revenue. And we're therefore prepared to overlook and tell a story of reintegration and being apologetic and giving him a second chance and everything, until the fan base went, no, not a chance. So I think it's a case of these values that companies come out with currently, unless we make a noise, are only okay and only, you know, sacrosanct up to a point. And that point is that it affects the mission of the business, which is usually shareholder value, profitability, these kind of things.
And I guess, you know, that by, you know, what I'm sort of kind of gathering here is, unless, you know, people do shout and push back and, you know, effectively hold organizations to account, because that's really what they're doing, and flipping the script and to the point where suddenly the mission, the shareholder value is compromised, then actually potentially nothing shifts. And we still end up with a situation where, you know, arguably men aren't going to work, and we're not going to ignite the silent majority, you know, the 4 out of 5, because everybody is trying to second guess actually where and how the reaction is going to be, because there is no clarity as to where that line is being drawn. Because arguably, to your point, Matt, it's, you know, if the mission is, you know, profitability, shareholder value, etc., the only reason Manchester United flipped was because that was in jeopardy, because the noise got so intense that they had to do something about it. If that noise hadn't happened, then potentially they wouldn't have done anything. But why should it come to that point to do that? Because that says that, to me, that if you worked in those organisations, actually a lot would be pushed under the carpet. I mean, maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, but it's just what it says, really.
Well, let's bring it to the modern world, and we talk about values lived and values against. Like, you know, we have a world that every UN organization in existence and Red Cross and everyone else says that there is a genocide being caused in Gaza, but the Israel government says there isn't, and therefore all governments choose to believe the Israel government as opposed to every single independent organization that says there is. And yet, surely all the governments value people and value lives and, you know, everything else, but we know it's not. And I think the last few years in society is showing us that. If we bring it to the companies, like Volkswagen were famously, they have a big about being environmental and sustainable. And years ago, they deliberately built a device to fool the emissions testers in their cars because their emissions were too high on their diesel cars. And they did millions of these things until it was discovered and they had to own it up, you know? So then how do we bring it back to ourselves? Because really that's where we want to go with this conversation too, Laura, because it's not institutions that are at fault. It has to be how we hold ourselves accountable, you know?
Yeah.
And like, so, you know, what's leading us? What's leading me in my actions? Is it my agenda, or is it who I want to become, or what I want to be, or the person I want to be, or the world I want to create, or the world I want to live in? You know, I think that's the really hard question that we have to ask ourselves in these spaces. Like, we can blame institutions and organizations, but at the end of the day, they're still run by people. They're still run by other humans who are making these decisions, who are, hey, I worked in the HSBC, and it's in the news. Remember, years ago, there was a news story at the time that they had been laundering Mexican drug cartel money between Mexico and banks in California, I think it was. And I was working in the cash department at the time. So I was looking at how they were doing it. I was like, look, this is obvious what they're doing here, you know? It was a huge story. And the chairman released a thing to the whole bank saying, like, look, we all bear responsibility for this. And I was thinking, no, I don't. I don't bear any responsibility whatsoever. What are you talking about? I didn't launder any Mexican drug cartel money, you know? But again, it's that thing, like, it's still humans making those decisions in all those spaces, as much as it's an institution or organization. And they're trying to protect the institution and protect the organization.
Yeah.
So for us, like, what are we trying to protect? Is it an ego? Are we trying to protect the image that we have of ourselves? What is it that we let our agenda run free of our values and where we cross over?
And I think you're absolutely right, because at the end of the day, you know, an organization, an institution is really just a collective of people and what they individually stand for and values and, you know, how they operate in the world. And I suppose that is the hard challenge, because we do, as you say, have to look at ourselves and go, you know, what's really going on here for us? You know, to what side, as it were, do we want to stand? And is this something that I'm going to willingly endorse? But it's a hard one, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's how people experience us and how we show up matters. And because what we say versus what we do within that can be a huge gap. And it's in that gap that I think people start to get very apprehensive about where and how, you know, the conditions can form within, you know, whether it's communities, whether it's organizations, whether it's teams. You know, that's the gap for me, that if we don't look at ourselves first, it will just, it almost has this ripple effect. It sort of almost kind of has an impact on everyone around us. But I think, you know, for me, it's where do we start, and how do we take that first step? And I think it's probably being true to ourselves first, maybe.
Yeah.
Of what we value.
Calling ourselves out, like, you know, being very clear on what matters to us and what's important to us. Like, I know I've mentioned before, my wife is always sending me stuff, like, you know, look at this video about, you know, what women go through and stuff, you know, what women have to do. Like, she's always sending me stuff because we have daughters. She's like, you need to be aware of this, you know?
Yeah.
And so that is a constant challenge to my agenda for where I think the world is safe, I'm grand, there's nothing to worry about. What's the reality? What the world I want my kids to grow up in? What's the value of that, you know? Like, my youngest went on a train today on her own for the first time. And she would struggle with these kind of things. Executive function wouldn't be the best. And the person who was supposed to meet her missed the train, so wasn't there. So she had to then get another train to somewhere else.
Yeah.
But our advice to her, like, and this goes to show you the world we live in, we're saying, look, okay, so you sit in a train, sit beside, if you see a mother with kids, sit close to them. You see, you know, pick where it's safe and sit where it's safe.
Yeah.
As opposed to, it's safe, you know? No, it's not that it's safe. Pick where it's safe. Find the safe space and sit there. Like, which is, you know, what's the world if I'm having to give that advice?
No, and you're right. It's sort of an indictment on, you know, the world that we find ourselves in, is that that's how we may experience it, and therefore we're almost preempting that is going to be the experience, and it feels like we have a long way to go.
It does, and I think for me, this all sort of serves to bring it back to a point that we've made before, that inaction is no longer an option, because inaction means that values will be compromised in the pursuit of profit and things like this. So it does take people, not just, and I mean men, I guess, really with this, it does take us not just not tolerating it, but saying that we don't tolerate it, being quite clear on that, and being quite clear on where lines are. Because, yeah, if we don't, we can see that institutions won't change. The establishment won't change, because if at first moment it runs contrary to the mission, it'll get compromised.
Yeah. And then people don't believe, and then at that point, then people don't engage, because they can't see the impact that, you know, it's going to have in their voicing whatever the concern is, whoever that is. Well, folks, as ever, fantastic to see you guys, and we're not having one in August because we're going to take a month off, so we're not going to meet again until September. But as ever, have a fabulous August, and look forward to catching up with everybody in September.
Thanks all.
Thank you.